Because he's a liar.
Because much as that would be cool.
Yeah.
Can you make me this nice?
Yeah. Mississippi one time.
This is the game Sally was playing last night.
Get a little marshmallow fluff in the room.
Oh, Slytherin, yeah.
Oh, she made it.
It's like Mario.
Wow. When is the next Friday? Is that when it's coming out?
Yeah. Eat more snake.
I want to go see it.
All right, good morning.
Hi.
Wow.
Just want to talk briefly about the next thing that's due in the paper. So we have a break coming up, an awesome thing to do over the break would be to work on your paper.
Oh, yeah.
You scheduled that, you guys are set aside for that, I hope. And one reason why it would be good, well, there's a couple reasons. The full paper is due not too long after break, so in terms of the rough draft, it's like a week or two at most. So that's one reason. But on the day after you get back from break, you need to have finished and submitted on D2L, I think by the end of that day, revised bibliography, revised topic, and notes on 5 of your sources. And those notes need to basically show that you've been reading your stuff and that you have been taking notes and that you have page numbers. Okay? So very important when you're taking the notes, make sure you write down page numbers along with your notes. And the reason for that is what? When you go to cite it in your paper, you don't want to have to go, oh, I took that book back to the library, what am I going to do now, right? You want to have that on your notes so that you can just say, oh yeah, I found this right on page 4, there it is in my citation, and I'm all good to go. So anyway, that's due on Monday when you get back. Questions about that? Yes.
Is there a particular format you want the notes in, or does it just have to be like
What I
quote and then the book and the notes?
So I don't actually think that that's a good question. Sometimes when people take notes these days, what they do is they just copy stuff out of the source and put it in their notes. Like literally copy, like just, oh, this looks good, I'll copy that and put it in your source. I would prefer that you're actually writing out your own thoughts on this stuff. One reason is that because when you start doing that, you're actually starting to write your paper. So when you start to reflect on the notes and summarize and and put that into some of your own thoughts, you're starting the writing process. If you do take a quote, that's fine. It should be like there should be something magical about the language, right? It should be something that if you didn't quote it, we wouldn't be able to get the full effects, right? When you do your papers, that's one of the things that we'll be looking for is how do you handle quotations, because it's one of the traps you could fall into in the paper is just having like quotation 1, and then there was this other quotation 2, and then this person did this, quotation 3, right? And it ends up seeming like you kind of cut it out of the books and just sort of pasted it together rather than actually writing your own material. Okay, so you want to paraphrase and write things in your own words as much as you possibly can, and save quotes for that one situation where this was what the composer said about the piece, and it's really interesting, and I'm going to unpack it for the next 2 paragraphs. That's when you need a quote, right? You don't want to quote this, Beethoven was born in 1770. That is not information that you need to have quoted. That's information that should be paraphrased, right? And the most of what you find should probably be paraphrased and not quoted.
And for the purposes of turning in the actual notes, is there some specified length that you're looking for, or like?
No. It's going to be. I'm going to glance at it, and I'm going to make a judgment as to whether you've been reading and whether you've got some significant material out of there. So, okay. I would think that you're going to have 5 pages of notes. I would be surprised if you didn't have, something like that. Okay. So, on the computer, if you're taking single space notes, maybe not quite as much as that, but there should be, a substantial amount on each source.
Okay.
And, so what I do on the computer is I put the page number on the left margin. I set up a hanging indent like you do for bibliography, right, where you drag over the little bottom part of the paragraph marker, and then, so page number, hit tab, do your note, hit return, page number, do a tab, do your note, page number, that sort of thing. That's how I do it. But you can do it other ways if you want, as long as the page numbers are there and I'm seeing that you're paraphrasing material out of the sources.
So we can turn this in handwritten and that's fine.
You could, if you wanted to, turn it handwritten, take a picture of it. It's gotta be turned in on D2L. So if you prefer to write it out by hand, you could just take a picture of it with your phone or whatever and submit it that way. Or scan it, yeah.
Is it due before class on Monday or?
No, it's due at
Monday?
the end of the day on Monday when you come back. Anything else? All right, so today we're gonna talk about orchestral music in the second half of the century. And this is when the modern orchestral world as we know it really takes shape. I've got a picture here of the Vienna Philharmonic in their home hall, the Musikverein, the golden hall of the Society of Friends of Music in Vienna, which is just a stunning place. It was built in the 1860s, but it's meant to look like a Renaissance sort of palace. So when you look up, the entire ceiling of this place is painted with all kinds of beautiful decorations and frescoes. It looks like one of those golden eggs that you get, that's got all sort of beautiful like enamel painting on it and whatever. The columns on the sides of this, there's a balcony that runs around the whole thing. It's held up by these columns, which are called caryatids. It's a Greek sort of sculpture of a woman holding the balcony on her head, right? So everything is just fantastically beautiful in this building. And it was built as a kind of temple of orchestral music. There's no behind the stage, for example. There's no proscenium. You couldn't do theater in here if you wanted to. You couldn't do an opera if you wanted to. And the notion of creating a hall specifically for orchestral music comes out of the 19th century. Prior to that, orchestras played in theaters or they played in just a regular room or wherever they could find to play. But now you've got to have, if you're a big city and you've got a really great orchestra, you've got to have their own hall for them. And that is true in the States today too, right? If it's a big time symphony, they're going to have their own hall, which is only for the purpose of symphonic music and can't really be, Pittsburgh's kind of lagging in that regards. They don't have a true orchestral hall. They have a converted movie theater, which you can actually use for stage productions. But if you go to Philadelphia, has anybody been in the new hall in Philadelphia? Oh man, you have got to go and see this hall. The whole thing is shaped like a cello. When you're inside, it feels like you're inside of a cello. It's all this beautiful wood, and it's got this curved shape, which is meant to resemble the inside of a cello. It's absolutely incredible. Or Disney Hall in Los Angeles, somewhere. Have you been there?
Yeah.
Isn't it? It's just like a magical
It's so
wonderland. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is unbelievable.
It's shaped like a piano.
Is it shaped like a piano? Okay, that may be. Frank Gehry is the architect, and he's one of these modern architects that like makes the building look like he built it out of paper mache or something. It's super cool. But except it's all silver and metallic and everything. But anyway, this idea of the sort of temple of orchestral music, this happens in the late 19th century when you get groups like the Vienna Philharmonic, the New York Philharmonic, the Boston Symphony, and eventually the Chicago Symphony and the other major orchestras. So here they are, the Vienna Philharmonic. Their main job was to play in the opera, and that kind of tells you a bit about the history of the orchestra, because it wasn't really possible to have a full-time professional orchestra until the 19th century. If you were a professional orchestra, it was because you were playing in the opera. That was the thing that was driving all of that. And then occasionally, like a loyal person might have an orchestra at their disposal. But their main job was to play for the Vienna Court Opera. And then they figured out, well, we've got extra time, but we're not playing in the opera. We could give concerts on our own as an orchestra. So they started up the Vienna Philharmonic. And even today, that's what happens. You have to be accepted into the opera orchestra, and then you get to play with the Philharmonic. So that's how they function. I don't know if there's any women in the orchestra in this picture. Maybe one, the harp player. And for years and years and years, the Vienna Philharmonic was all male ensemble, and they sort of made that a point of pride, actually. In the 2000s, that started to become very controversial. There were a number of activists who really started to say, this is ridiculous to have this, all male orchestra and to exclude women from from their ranks. They were a private organization, so they kind of got away with it for a long time. And but they would say things like, well, when we're having women in the orchestra, it would ruin the spirit of male camaraderie that we have. When we start really cooking in a Mahler symphony or something like that, having women in the group, it would change the feeling of it, stuff like this. So eventually the publicity became too great. They would play concerts every year in Carnegie Hall, and after a while, people were literally protesting outside of the hall about their policies. So now they have taken women into their ranks, and there's still not that many of them, but you will see women playing with the Philharmonic now. So interesting history with that group. They also have their own oboes and their own horns and their own trumpets, which are slightly different than the models that you know. Like the trumpets are all piston valves, and they're the kind of trumpet that lays on its side. The horns I think are single horns maybe. The oboes are not Böhm system oboes, so they have a different fingering system than the modern oboe, and they have a special sound because they own a lot of their own instruments. So the Vienna Philharmonic. The way that I think of organizing the music of the late 19th century is along the lines of program music and non-program music or absolute music. Although the terms are a little different. So there's the progressive wing and there's the historicist wing. And you could also use conservative wing for this side. And essentially this was an argument between composers and critics in that time period where they couldn't agree sort of on the aesthetic basis of orchestral music. On the one hand, you had people like Liszt and Wagner, and I didn't put Berlioz on here, but he would also be in that category. And their position was essentially that music needed to communicate beyond just the music, that you needed to be able to get something out of it besides just hearing the different themes and understanding how they're manipulated and so forth. And for them, there had to be a program. There had to be some kind of a title or a written out program that you would give to the audience that would say, this is what this piece is about, and then people could talk about it afterwards. In that light, they composed in some new genres. The symphonic poem was Liszt's invention, and then the music drama was Wagner's invention, and various other kinds of programmatic genres, but they also did write programmatic symphonies, but these sort of new genres was their idea to spur the symphony to new heights. They also, because they were interested in program music, were more willing to consider strange combinations of chords, or strange melodies, or strange numbers of movements, or configurations of the orchestra. And if you imagine Liszt's symphony, which he called the Dante Symphony. So the Dante Symphony based on the Divine Comedy by Dante, which has three parts to it: hell, purgatory, and heaven. And if you think about composing music for hell, that's probably not going to be attractive music, right? The first lines of the Divine Comedy are "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here," and it's it's extremely dark. You're going into hell. So Liszt wrote music that was appropriate for that. But a lot of people said, well, this is just ugly. Why do I want to listen to ugly music? Why do I want to hear lots and lots of dissonance? Why do I want to follow that? I mean, that's not music. Music is supposed to be beautiful. So the programmatic folks were willing to accept that some music would not be beautiful. Maybe later, they'll write beautiful music. I mean, heaven is beautiful, but hell is not. So that was that idea. And along with Liszt and Wagner, you have Richard Strauss, Camille Saint-Saëns, Bedřich Smetana, Franck, Dandy, and Tchaikovsky. They all wrote lots of programmatic pieces that we hear today. On the other side, the historicist position was essentially, we want to stick with what worked for Beethoven. So Beethoven wrote these great symphonies that didn't have a program, and everybody could get these ideal meanings out of them. When we hear the Fifth Symphony, we don't know exactly what it's about, but it seems to be about something, and that's enough for us, right? Brahms did not want any programs in his symphonies. He figured that you could get some kind of ideal content out of them, but he didn't want to have to tell you what that was, right? He wanted to write a beautiful work, which could have lots of meaning, but he didn't necessarily want to be the one to tell you what that was. So they kind of stuck with the Beethoven model. They didn't explore as much of the harmony because they wanted to maintain the beauty of music. They stuck with more traditional genres like just the symphony without a program, or chamber music like string quartet or the trio, piano trio or piano quartet. And some composers actually wrote in both categories. So while Brahms didn't write any programmatic music, Dvorak wrote pieces that are both absolute music that have no programmatic anything, but then he also wrote pieces that do have programs. Like he has 4 symphonic poems, for example, and he has the New World Symphony, which has kind of a program. And Saint-Saëns did the same thing. He has some just absolute music and some music that was very clearly programmatic. So that's kind of the lay of the land. Yes.
In the book, when it talks about symphonic poem,
Mhm.
it mentions that it's another name for the or it comes from the concert overture. Is there any main difference between them, or is it more like a rebranding?
It's more of a rebranding, honestly. I mean, Mendelssohn's concert overtures were essentially symphonic poems. He just didn't have that name. But I suppose the main difference would be that a concert overture usually had to go with some kind of a play, usually a play, generally. And the symphonic poem had a wider variety of stuff that it could communicate.
Okay.
So it could be completely made up program, like some of the one we're going to look at. Liszt completely made up the program essentially, rather than basing it on a play. And the symphonic poem also has more freedom in terms of form. So the concert overture almost always some kind of symphonic first movement, basically just a sonata form piece.
Okay.
Liszt was willing to go a little further than that. So, but yeah, it was largely marketing. It's true. So here's Liszt's idea. We have to have a poetic content. And maybe this was just the way Liszt thought about music. Liszt was inspired to write music by poetry, by thoughts, by philosophy. He certainly was inspired by just musical ideas as well, but for him, it was this connection with a poetic idea that really spurred his imagination, and he thought that that's how other people would hear music as well. So he conceives of this idea of the symphonic poem. At first, he actually calls some of his works overtures. So some of the pieces that we now know as symphonic poems, he just originally had called it an overture. But then he came up with this idea to rename it, and that really took off. So some differences to the symphony, they're usually just one movement, and the movement should be ideally formed to fit the program somehow. He uses a technique called thematic transformation, and this is similar to what Beethoven did in the Fifth Symphony. Just as this becomes right, so the first theme becomes something else in the second theme, but it's very similar, right? Or in the let's see, there's other parts where that's transformed. So this will take a theme and transform it into different shapes, different modes. For example, it could become minor if it was major, or vice versa, and uses that to kind of show you what happens throughout the whole piece. All right, and he does this. It's similar to the Idée fixe in Symphonie Fantastique, but maybe there'll be more than one of them rather than just the one. But very, very similar idea to the Idée fixe. Similar to the leitmotif, but he develops them a lot more than Wagner tends to do. And the subject of his symphonic poems, they were always these big topics, something related to a major life topic of love, death, heroism, philosophy. He didn't write them about simple things typically. So the one we're going to look at is not in the anthology, and there's score here online, and then the music is online as well. And in this one, it's called Late Prelude. I'll show you the program, and then I'll come back to this slide. The program that he wrote, and this is what Liszt wrote. This is a translation of Liszt's actual program. So he handed this out to the audience when he played this piece, and they would ideally read this and then listen to the piece. And essentially what it is like following the course of someone's life, from youthful exuberance to mature, developed powers, something like that. So the idea of preludes, what else is our life but a series of preludes, that unknown hymn, the first and solemn note of which is intoned by death. Sort of eternal life, I guess, would be the thing there. Liszt was a very devoted Catholic. And so he says, love is the dawning glow of all existence, and sort of youthful optimism, right? You all have youthful optimism, but then there's some storm that's going to come into your life. You're going to go to music history class and get a bad grade, or you're going to go out on the recital stage and forget your mouthpiece, or whatever's going to happen. Or your read will be crappy that day, or now I'm just teasing you. Yes. So you may not have experienced this yet, but you're going to have some time in your life when you get fired, when you have a major breakup, and maybe you've already experienced this, right?
Yep.
So he's saying, this is going to happen in everyone's life. And then what do? Well, you kind of go back and retreat into nature, and you try and kind of regather your stories, your strength, right? And then after you've kind of regathered your strength in nature, eventually you're going to hear the call of the trumpet again, the sound of the alarm, which hastens you back to the battle, whatever that battle was, whether that battle was trying to get a bunch of middle schoolers to play their instruments correctly, or whatever your battle is. You're going to go back to that, and having sort of learned and matured, you're going to be in full consciousness of yourself and entire possession of your energy. So this is the idea of the program. Now, how he does this musically is through thematic transformation. So throughout the piece, you're going to hear a 3-note motive. And that 3-note motive is going to be manipulated in various ways to tell this story. So when you first hear it, right at the beginning, it's very soft. Dealing without snow plows and with sound. Here we go. There's a 3-note motive. He makes an introduction out of that for a while. But then eventually we're going to get to the main theme. Idealistic person, and then they fall in love, and the love theme is also based on this 3-note motive. Just the 2-note part of it there. This is really a separate theme that he will transform also. But eventually we get to the storms of life, and then he takes that same motive, the 3-note motive from the beginning, and transforms that into something more tense. guys, and you can kind of almost imagine, yeah, this is how the character is doing at this moment in the symphonic poem. He's not doing very well, he's struggling. So eventually, though, he comes out of the conflict, and we have the initial theme come back. He reverses it, though. So this is something that he can do in the symphonic poem. He doesn't have to follow the exact symphonic way. He can have the second theme come back first, and then bring back the first theme at the end to create a slightly different conclusion. And here since he's building up the person again, builds up this love theme quite a And eventually we're going to get back to the first theme, but now it's going to be in its full form of all of its strength. Notes in the symphony, right? Pretty exciting for the 1850s. But so this is how the thing works. Now he has this one other idea here of the multi-function form, where instead of having separate movements, you kind of run the whole thing together as one long movement. But each part of it can come to seem like it would be a separate movement. So the first theme, which could also seem like the first movement. The second theme could seem like the slow movement, and the scherzo could be the development, and the finale could be the recapitulation. And this idea of having, the Germans call it the Mehrsätzlichkeit in der Einsätzlichkeit, or multiple movements in one movement. And that form is used by Richard Strauss and other people in the century. All right, so that's Les Préludes. And then we're going to turn to Vienna, where this is kind of like where the story of old Europe ends, in a way. 1875, by 1875, we've got all the major countries have formed into their modern form, like Germany is now Germany, and Italy is now unified Italy. You have Britain and France continuing on. And then you've got this kind of archaic thing in the eastern part of Europe called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that was holding together like 20 different ethnic groups, national groups. So it would include Austrians, obviously, but also Czechs and Bohemians and Slovaks and Slovenians and Serbs and Croats and Macedonians and Poles and so all these different ethnic groups that all kind of wanted their own say in things, and yet they were under the thumb of the Austrian emperor. So they managed to hold that together until 1914, and then it blew apart, and it took the rest of Europe with it and sort of ushered in the modern age. But during this time, this last sort of 25 years of it, it was sort of its final glory, right? And a lot of stuff was happening in Vienna. So you had new modernist ideas, you had new ideas in science, with psychology, Sigmund Freud, the unconscious, this notion that there's all these thoughts sort of swimming around underneath your ability to notice them. And this is the place where Mahler comes into it, right? So Mahler is Jewish, which was one of the ethnic things that comes into play in late 19th century Vienna. And the unconscious, one could say, is sort of his playground. And maybe hear more about that. All right, so I'm gonna turn it over to the group, and they're gonna tell us about Mahler and the third symphony of Mahler, or the first symphony of Mahler, third movement, which you have in your anthology, so you're gonna wanna get that out. 404. Oh, I gotta switch the.
I say I don't.
Yeah, sorry. I forgot about that.
You broke it.
Oh no. And then, please.
You're looking for, oh, you wanna,
I did press something and it just. And then,
you can drag that over on the other monitor if you want, that window.
Yeah, like drag it.
wow.
Press these.
I don't want to mess anything up.
So Mahler, 1860 to 1911, he was Bohemian Jewish Catholic. He was a conductor and a part-time composer, and he's known for his 10 symphonies and various songs for voice and piano. Something that was really cool was that from a young age, he was doing things that were like virtuosic and like prodigy. So he was a conductor at the Vienna Court Opera and the Vienna Philharmonic when he was 37 years old. And later on in his life, he came to the US where he conducted the New York Phil and did the Pittsburgh tour when he was 47.
He
And
killed the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. I'll explain that later. He did.
he established modern conducting gestures, and nearly all of his works were for orchestra and many with voices, and he was analyzed by Floyd.
So we have symphony number 1. There is 3 different versions. The first version was premiered in Budapest in 1889. There was no exploratory program, and that was revised once again and performed in Hamburg. After that, he added the title Titan. It's based on a romantic novel by John Paul. Then the other revised version was in 1906. It was performed in Vienna. The title and the program were deleted, and then Movement 3, which he was first called, with the German Blumen, flower, which means flowers, which is deleted, and he added the third movement, which we're going to talk about, the funeral march. So, and most of his symphonies were, various symphony was published as, exists as a traditional form in the form. So this is the original program notes. So he had his symphony in 2 parts. So part 1 was from the days of youth, which is the flower, fruit, and thorn pieces. Another part 1 was spring and no end. This introduction describes awakening of a nature at the earliest of dawn. 2 was flowering chapter, Luam, which was a Dante, and then 3 was set with full sails, the short sail. Then part 2 was Commedia. I can't pronounce these. And number 4 was Umana. I have a hard time pronouncing a lot of these.
That's okay.
4 was Stranded, which is the third movement, which is Funeral March. It's in the manner of a Cagliot. And then 5, Dale Inferno, which is a Allegro Furioso, as a sudden expression of deeply wounded heart. And then in the first performance, the following program notes, like these were attributed to the symphony. And then the programmatic notes were eventually dropped with the 1896 performance in Berlin because Mahler did not want the audience to be misled by what he perceived the piece as. And then each movement is, I said I have a hard time pronouncing a lot of these. So like the first movement is it's slow and it drags. It's an very string throughout. It's in D major as well. And he has a quote from one of his songs, I Walk Across the Field This Morning. And it is modified in sonata form. Movement 2 is moving strongly but not too quickly. It's a scherzo and a trio based on a
Lenzler.
Yeah, Landler. I was getting there. A traditional Austrian waltz. And then the third movement is stately and measured without rushing. It's a funeral march based on the children's song Bears Jacques, or Bruno Martin, as Mahler would call it, in D minor. It's also linked to the second movement of Beethoven's Eroica. And the fourth movement is From Hell to Paradise. Is a Castle-Stravic Stalin song. There's a breakthrough, fallback, breakthrough again, triumph, and this serves as the expansive finale.
So the third movement, it kind of goes with this picture. So this is the Hunter's Funeral March. Usually, when you think of a funeral march, isn't it usually like the hunter carrying the animal saying, ooh, look what I have got? Well, this photo is the exact opposite. It's the animals, it's the hunted burying the hunter. So, and this was the inspiration for the third movement of Mahler Symphony No. 1.
So the initial and recurring melodic material is based on, as I said already, the popular, as Mahler would call it, Bruno Martin, but known as Ferenc Jacques, and put it into a round, and then he also puts it in minor mode. And the first subject is presented by a solo double bass following a bassoon, tuba, and eventually the entire orchestra. Then the counter melody is played over top the canon in oboe. It's also, as we said, Mahler is Jewish, but this is one of the pieces that's criticized for having Jewish qualities, and it has a lot of we're gonna listen to it here in a little bit, but it's criticized for having a lot of Klemmer music, which is a lot of like Jewish sounding music. So go to the next slide. So if you want to click on that link. So if you want to get your anthology out real quick, we're gonna look at the score here. This is the volume up.
Yeah.
You can hear it there. This is where the round starts. The check off the bass here. And the cello starts. Next, the oboe. Moving up in measure 38 is where he switches gears and goes to the final music. You can hear it, especially if he adds the E flat clarinet, adds a lot to that.
Who is Lenny conducting?
Bernstein.
Who is he conducting?
Oh.
What
Oh,
Oh no.
Turn this off.
Turn that off. And this,
I'm not.
this,
Hold on.
and